Hello everyone, my name is Xiamora and you're listening to KWDC 93.5 Delta College Radio. The show you're tuned into right now was put together by students and staff enrolled in the broadcasting courses at Delta College here in the Digital Media Department. Thank you for listening and supporting college radio. My name is Xiamora and this is Macabre Musings. Today I'll be talking about the history and origins of goth music. So dim the lights, sit back, and enjoy. So the origins of goth music can actually be traced back to the late 1960s, with bands like The Doors and the Velvet Underground really being the main ones that would influence the goth music scene that would show up later in the 1970s. In 1967, the music critic John Stickney used the term gothic rock to describe the music of The Doors. And if you're at all familiar with The Doors music, it's not hard to see why. A lot of The Doors songs have this gloomy and just really atmospheric sound, and a lot of the lyrics are dark, depressing, philosophical, all traits that would be passed down to the goth music scene later. Right now I'm going to play a short clip of The End by The Doors so you can hear the characteristics of their music, well, an example of those characteristics, and so you can see how that got translated into gothic bands later on. So here is The End.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end, I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be so limitless and free? Desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land.
So that was The End by The Doors, of course. Not the whole song. I don't think I can play the whole song on college radio, to be honest. I would if I could, but yeah, if you did like that little clip, go ahead and go listen to the whole song. Honestly, go listen to The Doors' entire discography. This is not about The Doors, but they're honestly one of my favorite bands. They're not technically gothic, more like the forefathers to gothic music, but that doesn't matter. Honestly, they're really good. I really like the philosophical and just sometimes strange. They often had strange lyrics. Jim Morrison, the singer who wrote the lyrics for the band, he was a very strange and eccentric person. And a lot of people in the goth music scene are strange and eccentric as well. So it's easy to see how the Doors have influenced so many gothic bands. Another Doors song that I feel would be a really good example of this kind of gothic, pre-gothic sound is Riders on the Storm, with the rain and the very just eerie atmosphere that song has. It's great, but this is not about the Doors. This is about the goth music. So let me get back on track. So gothic music came from the post-punk music scene. It kind of diverged from the post-punk music scene, and this all started in England during the 1970s. So you'll notice that many goth bands are British. I don't know what it is about England that makes all these great goth artists appear, but yeah, a majority of them are British. A lot of the ones that I'm going to talk about are British. The Doors and the Velvet Underground, I should mention, are American, but they influenced these British groups. So in the late 1970s is where goth music really started to take off. And one thing I want to mention is that a lot of times in real life, goth music and post-punk, those terms will get intertwined. People will use them interchangeably. Just because at that time in the late 70s, you know, these bands like Susie and the Banshees and Joy Division and Bauhaus and The Cure, and they were all, you know, experimenting and kind of creating the sound that would become goth music while also coming from this post-punk scene. So it's really, I'm not a stickler for these, you know, genres or terms. Some people are, I'm not, but a lot of times they are used interchangeably in real life. For the purpose of this episode, I'm gonna use only goth music to describe the specific bands or songs, but yeah, a lot of times in real life, people will use goth music, new wave, post-punk. There are so many different subgenres, and it can drive you a little bit crazy sometimes, but just an FYI. So Joy Division is one of those bands that had a lot of influence in the post-punk / goth music scene. In 1979, they released their first album, Unknown Pleasures. And Unknown Pleasures is such a good album. I highly recommend it to anyone, honestly. But it is very, it's very dark. I know we're talking about goth music, and that's the whole shtick about goth music, right? It's that it's dark and sad. But Joy Division is an especially dark band, I guess, if you want to say that. Their music is very, I would describe it as kind of avant-garde-ish. There's a lot of, I don't know, electronic sounds going on, some industrial-like sounds, definitely a lot of experimental sounds going on there in both their albums that they released. And of course their lyrics are very dark, depressing, also philosophical, as I mentioned with the Doors lyrics. The lead singer and lyricist for Joy Division, Ian Curtis, was a very troubled person. He struggled a lot with his mental health. He had depression. He also had epilepsy, which could sometimes lead to really bad seizures. He was struggling in his marriage. There was a lot going on in this man's life, and you can hear that in the lyrics. It's a very interesting listening experience, I'll say that. Not bad, but it's interesting because you can really understand his state of mind at the time that he was writing these lyrics. And unfortunately, Ian Curtis would later kill himself. He died in 1980, shortly before the band released their second album. So that is a little bit of sad, dark history in the goth music history, but still, I highly recommend Joy Division to anyone. If you can handle those types of lyrics, it can get a little bit depressing sometimes, but if you can relate to that sort of state of mind, those emotions, or even if you can just appreciate the beauty of the lyrics and the music, I think you'll find something that you like in Joy Division. Or not. I don't know. Joy Division, I feel like, is one of those bands that maybe is not for beginners in the goth or punk, post-punk music scene. I don't know, but that's my sales pitch for Joy Division. So, in the late 1970s, post-punk is shifting towards goth music, and in the 80s, you're going to see the goth music scene explode. Now it's time for a short break, but we'll be right back here on Delta College Radio 93.5. Alright, hello everyone, and welcome back to Macabre Musings. I'm your host, Xiamora, and we just talked about the early origins of goth music. So in the late 1970s, goth music is really starting to pick up as a subgenre, and many groups are starting to emerge and release their own music. One of those groups is Bauhaus. Yes, they are British, as I mentioned before the break that many of these groups are British. So Bauhaus released their first single in 1979. This single was called Bela Lugosi's Dead. Bela Lugosi, if you don't know, is the actor who played Dracula in the Dracula movies from the 1930s made by Universal. So this reference to Bela Lugosi and how he played Dracula in this very gothic, romantic gothic movie, I feel like it just amplifies the gothic image more, especially Bauhaus's image of being this gloomy and melodramatic band and having their music reflect that. So the release of Bela Lugosi's Dead is seen as the start, like pretty much the official start of goth music. It's considered really the first goth single, and I'm going to play a little bit for you right now. Now, I'm not going to play the entire song because it's almost 9 minutes long. Yeah, the entire recording is almost 9 minutes, so it is a long one, but if you like what you hear, I definitely recommend you go back and listen to the entire thing. It's a very good song. Not my favorite Bauhaus song personally, but it's a very good one, and you can see how the release of this song really marks the shift in gothic music, the breakaway from the post-punk kind of sound, and really just the gothic shtick that would, the iconic gothic sound that would be created in the early 1980s. So here we go. Here is Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus.
Goose is dead. The bats have left the bell tower. The victims have been bled. Red velvet lines. The black box. Bela Lugos is dead. Bela Lugos is dead.
So that was Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus. That was, of course, released in 1979, Bauhaus's first single and the first official goth single. And in 1980, a year later, Bauhaus would release their first album called In the Flat Field, and this is considered to be the first gothic album. So, of course, another iconic band that also released an album in 1980 is The Cure, with the release of their album 17 Seconds. Now, The Cure is like one of the goth scene staples. I don't know how else to say it. They're just, when you're first getting into goth music, that is one of the bands that like people will put you on, is The Cure, and for good reason too. They are just iconic in so many ways. Their sound, they have a lot of songs that really aren't goth music, but their sound is just so iconic. Robert Smith, the singer of the band, just so iconic. So definitely check out The Cure if you haven't already. Back to 17 Seconds, that was released in 1980 with the single A Forest coming from that album, and A Forest was actually The Cure's first song to chart on the UK singles chart. It would reach number 31, which may not sound like a big deal, but for a band like The Cure, which up until that point really had been kind of like this obscure band coming from this niche music scene, that is a really big deal, and The Cure kind of helped propel goth music into the mainstream. And 17 Seconds as an album really helped define The Cure's sound. In 1979, a year before, The Cure released their first album, but it was more like a rock, punk-ish sounding album. It wasn't really the iconic gothic and moody sound that most people associate with The Cure. And later in the 1980s, The Cure would see even more mainstream success with albums like Head on the Door. And The Cure just really, throughout the 80s and early 90s, really cemented themselves as an iconic goth band. A year later, in 1981, Susie and the Banshees would release their album Juju, and that is a very influential album. I don't know if their entire discography or that entire album could be described as goth. Again, it goes back to that, the interchangeability between the terms goth and post-punk. There is a lot of bands. There are a lot of bands that can be described as both, and Susie and the Banshee is one of them. Either way, Juju was a highly influential album. That's where the song Spellbound comes from. It's one of my favorite Susie and the Banshee songs. Maybe one of the very few that I actually like. I don't know. Not that Susie and the Banshees are bad, but I feel like their sound just doesn't have the same appeal to me. Moving on, in the mid-1980s, there would be a shift in goth music. Up until that point, goth music had been pretty slow, pretty melancholy. It had been a little more contained. That's how I would describe it. But in 1985, the Sisters of Mercy, a British band also. The Sisters of Mercy would release their debut album, First and Last and Always. So this album was released in 1985, and it is still an influential album in the goth music scene to this day. The Sisters of Mercy really changed the goth music scene at the time and made it sound more rock, for lack of a better term. It really put the rock in gothic rock. They had a brighter, more energetic sound to them. They had a drum machine that they used. A lot of their songs from that album, First and Last and Always, and also their later songs, you can definitely rock out to. I don't know how else to describe it, but they definitely have a lot of more energetic songs. More songs that could be described as alternative gothic rock. I don't know. But that album did allow the Sisters of Mercy to become icons in the goth music scene as well. They're still very highly influential. I would say they aren't as popular as maybe some of the bands that I mentioned earlier, like The Cure. I mean, let's be honest, nobody is really as popular as The Cure, but the Sisters of Mercy were able to later achieve some mainstream success with the release of their next album called Floodland, and for a moment they were in the spotlight in the English music scene. So a lot of the bands I've mentioned, like the Sisters of Mercy, Bauhaus, The Cure, a lot of them have had commercial success at the time that they released their music, but they have never been fully mainstream. And it's interesting because I feel like almost everybody knows what a goth person looks like, right? Like, you typically have the white makeup, the heavy eyeliner, the long black clothes, all of that. But so few people actually know about goth music or goth culture in general. And I just think it's interesting because a lot of people will have these assumptions about goths just by the way they look, So that is just one thing that I find interesting about goth music and the goth subgenre. And the history of the goth subgenre as a whole goes far, far back, further back than the 60s, which is where I mentioned that goth music got its start. But I just want to end this episode by saying that the goth community is a really welcoming community, a really wholesome community, a community that doesn't judge you. And you don't have to dress goth if you like goth music, don't get me wrong, but it is a great community to be part of if you're interested. And that's all I have for this episode of Macabre Musings. Thank you so much for listening. Macabre Musings has been a production of KWDC 93.5 LPFM Delta College Radio. This program is made possible by listeners like you. Programming is produced by the students, staff, and faculty of San Joaquin Delta College's Digital Media Department. It is supported by the Delta College Department of Arts and Multimedia, the Career Technical Education and Workforce Development Office, and the State of California. Thank you for listening.